6 million people, one field in Munich. The Dravith Concordat had broken 42 worlds without firing a single shot, and their sensors measured victory one way. Count what the people drop. So they landed at the largest gathering on Earth, fired their weapon into the heart of it, and watched the counter stay at 0. If you enjoy stories where humanity refuses to break, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who would have stood their ground in that tent. Then drop a comment and tell me one thing you would never let an alien take from you. Now, let us move forward into the day the Bavarians would not spill a single drop. The festival grounds in Munich are called the Theresienwiss, although almost nobody says the whole word out loud. The locals call it the meadow, or simply the grounds, and for a little over 2 weeks each year it stops being an empty field and becomes the largest party on the planet. 6 million people walk across it. 8 million liters of beer move over its tables. 14 enormous tents rise out of bare grass, each one big enough to swallow a warehouse, each one built and taken down by hand. And above all of it, on a stone terrace at the western edge, a bronze statue of a woman stands 60 feet tall with a lion at her feet. Looking down at the whole beautiful mess with the expression of someone who has seen it before and expects to see it again. Every glass on that field is counted. That is the part outsiders never understand. The 1-liter glass stein does not belong to the customer, it belongs to the tent. It is counted in the morning, washed at night, and counted again, and if the number comes up short, somebody has to explain why. Sepp Baumgartner had been explaining that number for a very long time. He was 63 years old, built like a filing cabinet, and he ran the Krumholtz tent, which his grandfather had raised out of canvas and stubbornness, and which his father had handed to him with the words, "Do not embarrass me." Sepp had taken that instruction seriously for 31 seasons. He walked the rows before opening the way he did every morning. 6,000 seats, 1,100 meters of bench, 240 staff. He checked the table legs, he checked the aisles. He stopped at the wooden board nailed above the cellar stairs, where 3 words had been burned into the grain by a man who had died before Sepp learned to walk. Not one drop. It was not a slogan. It was the job. "Annelies," he called. Annelies Reiter came out of the service corridor with a tray she did not need yet because she never walked anywhere empty-handed. She was 38 and she was the reason the Krumholtz tent had a waiting list. She could carry 12 full steins at once. 12. That is roughly 70 pounds of glass and liquid balanced across 2 forearms through a moving crowd without looking down. In 19 seasons, she had never dropped one. "The cellar man is here," she said. "The American, the American." Sepp made a sound in his throat that could have meant anything. Down the cellar stairs, under the tent, in a cold concrete corridor that smelled like copper and hops. A man from Milwaukee named Marcus Hale was lying on his back under a glycol line with a wrench in his teeth. Marcus was 34. He serviced brewery cooling systems for a living, which meant he spent his life inside the small, unglamorous machines that keep beer at exactly the right temperature. He had flown across an ocean to fix a hose. He was aware of how that sounded. "Pressure is fine," he said, sliding out. "Your chiller is not." "Whoever bolted this in used the wrong gasket." "That was my brother-in-law," said Hansi Gruber. "Then your brother-in-law is a criminal." "Yes," Hansi agreed cheerfully. Hansi was the tapmaster. He was the man who put the wooden tap into the first keg, and he had opinions about foam that he expressed the way other men express religion. 3 fingers of head, not 2, not 4, 3. He had once refused to serve a member of parliament over it. "Explain to me again why the temperature matters so much," Marcus said, wiping his hands. Hansi looked at him the way a doctor looks at a patient who has asked whether blood is important. "Beer at the wrong temperature," he said, "is not beer. It is a complaint with foam on top." Up on the bandstand in the middle of the hall, Conrad Fischer was tuning his band. Conrad was 70, thin as a coat rack, and he conducted with a stick he had carved himself. His musicians sat in a raised wooden gallery above the crowd, which is a strange place to put a brass band until you have heard one from underneath. Every 20 minutes all day, Conrad's band played the toast song, Ein Prosit. When it started, 6,000 people stood up. They raised their glasses. They sang the same 11 seconds of melody. Then they drank and they sat down, and the noise of the hall closed over the moment like water. It was not really a song. It was a scheduled event like a tide. Outside, in the game's lane, an old man named Ottmar Zwick was polishing a wooden disc. The disc was 30 feet across, sunk into the floor of a wooden arena, and it was the oldest ride on the grounds. People sat on it. It spun. It spun faster. Then it threw them off one by one into a padded ring, while Ottmar sat above them with a microphone and insulted their technique. He had been doing this for 41 seasons. He had a philosophy about it, and he shared that philosophy with anybody who stood still long enough. Everything that stands up, Ottmar liked to say, falls down. It is only a question of how fast you turn it. And at the service gate, 6 heavy draft horses came through in harness, a ton of muscle each, pulling a brewery wagon stacked with barrels. Rudy Steinbach sat on the box with the reins loose in his hands. The horses were not impressed by the crowd. The horses had never been impressed by anything. By late morning, the grounds were full. The lanes were shoulder to shoulder. A Ferris wheel turned slowly against a flat gray sky. The smell of roast chicken and hot sugar and pretzel salt hung over everything. Inside the Krumholtz tent, Conrad lifted his stick. The band started the toast song for the 11th time that day. 6,000 people stood up, and that was the exact moment the sky went dark. Not cloudy, dark, the kind of dark that arrives from above and does not move. Annalise, standing at the head of aisle 4 with 12 full steins on her arms, looked up through the open ceiling vents. Conrad's stick slowed. 200 people near the doors were already pointing. Sepp Baumgartner walked out into the lane, stood in the middle of the crowd, and looked up at the enormous shadow spreading across the field, over the Ferris wheel, over the tents. Over the bronze woman on her terrace. Sepp, Hansi said behind him, "What is it?" Sepp did not answer because at that moment the shadow opened. Overseer Vor Kalish of the Draveth Concordat had a rule about first contact, and the rule was this: do not shoot. Shooting creates heroes, panic creates ruins. The Concordat had not fought a real battle in 3 generations. They did not need to. They had studied something better. Every population, on every world, holds itself together by a thin, invisible agreement that everyone will keep behaving normally. Break that agreement in one crowded place, and it tears outward on its own. Cities empty. Supply lines rot. Governments spend everything they have chasing their own frightened people. 42 worlds had folded that way. Not one of them had been invaded. All of them had simply come apart. The instrument that did it was called the dissonance. It was not a weapon in the way humans understood weapons. It was a low-frequency resonance field, tuned to the exact pitch at which a nervous system stops trusting the ground under it. Standing inside, it felt like a floor tilting that was not tilting, like a stair that was not there. It did not injure. It simply made staying still feel impossible. And the Concordat measured its effect with one number, the composure index, a count of how many objects a population let go of. "Overseer," said Peldranik the analyst, "target confirmed. 6 million individuals in a single enclosed area, in structures with metal frames, with no defensive installations of any kind. This is the densest voluntary gathering recorded on this world. Then it is the seed," Vor Kalish said. "Break it here and the continent breaks itself. Ground marshal." Heskvaro gave the signal. 3 landing craft came down on the main lane of the grounds, and the first thing they did was crush the ox roast. That needs explaining. In a low open pavilion near the center of the field, a whole ox turned slowly on an iron spit over a bed of coals. It had been turning since before sunrise. 6 men worked that pit in shifts, basting and turning and arguing, and they had been doing it for so many years that the arguments had become a kind of family. The landing craft came down on the spit. The iron bent. The coals went everywhere. The ox rolled off into the gravel. There was a silence in that pavilion of a type not often heard on this planet. The head of the pit crew, a man with forearms like ship rope, stared at the wreck of 11 hours of work. "They killed the ox," he said. "Again, it was already dead, Jorg. That is not the point." Ramps dropped. Draveth troopers came out in 2 columns, 7 feet tall in gray segmented armor, and formed a line across the lane. Their helmets had a single wide lens. Their gauntlets carried compact emitters instead of guns because the Concordat did not use guns on civilians. Guns made martyrs, martyrs made problems. HFY raised a translator plate and spoke, and the words rolled out across the grounds in flat, patient German. People of this territory. Your world is now under the authority of the Dravith Concordat. Remain where you are. Do not resist. You will not be harmed. Nobody moved, which HFY took as a promising start. Then the engine wash from the third craft rolled sideways into the doorway of the Krumholtz tent, and it hit Annalise Reiter's tray. 12 full steins. She had them balanced perfectly. The blast of hot air caught her right forearm and turned it, and 4 of the glasses slid and hit the boards and broke. Beer went across the floor in a sheet. Annalise looked down at it. Then she looked up at the 7-foot soldier standing 20 feet away. That, she said, is 4 glasses. Return to your dwelling. Those are counted. HFY did not have a response prepared for that because in 42 worlds of experience, nobody had ever opened negotiations with an inventory dispute. Inside the tent, Conrad Fisher's band had stopped playing. 6,000 people were still standing because the toast song had started and they had stood up, and now nobody had told them to sit. The translator plate boomed again through the open canvas. All gatherings are suspended. Disperse. Conrad Fisher, 70 years old, on a wooden gallery above a hall of 6,000, lowered his stick very slowly. He looked at the doorway. He looked at his musicians. We are 11 seconds from the end, he said. Conrad, said his tuba player, you do not stop a prosit. He raised the stick. The band came back in on the next beat, and 6,000 people who had been standing there with their arms half lifted finished the song, and drank and roared and sat down. On the flagship, Peldranik stared at his readout and felt something cold move through him. Overseer, composure index reading. Report it. 4, Vor Kalish turned. 4%, no overseer, 4 objects. 4 dropped objects out of a monitored population of 6 million. There was a pause on that command deck of a kind that had not occurred in 3 generations. Deploy the field, Vor Kalish said. 1/3 power. The dissonance came on. Down on the grounds, it felt like the whole meadow tipped 2 degrees to the left. The Ferris wheel groaned. Pigeons came off the rooftops in a sheet. 100,000 people put a hand out for something to hold. And then, mostly, they held on to what they were already holding. Because here is the thing the Concordat's models had never accounted for. In that field on that day, a very large number of people were walking around with a heavy glass vessel full of liquid that they had paid for, that they were responsible for, and that they had been taught since childhood not to spill. The dissonance made the ground feel unreliable. Every instinct in that crowd answered by steadying the glass first. Composure index, Vor Kalish said. Peldranik's voice had gone strange. 19, Overseer. It has moved from 4 to 19. 19 dropped objects in 6 million people. The model requires a minimum of 40,000 at this power level. Then the model is misreading. Overseer, the model has never misread. Down on the ground. Sepp Baumgartner stood in the lane outside his tent with the world tilting under him, and he watched a Dravith engineering team walk past him, down the outside wall, to the gray steel box on the north face of the Krumholtz tent. That box was the cooling plant. Every line in the cellar ran through it. An engineer cut the primary feed. The compressor died. The pump stopped. Sepp went very still. Marcus Hale came up the cellar stairs 2 at a time, wiping glycol off his hands, and found Sepp standing there with an expression Marcus did not like at all. They cut the chiller, Marcus said. Sepp, they cut the chiller. You have got maybe 40 minutes before every barrel under this tent is warm. Sepp Baumgartner looked at the alien ship hanging over the meadow. Then he looked at the dead compressor. They can invade the country, he said quietly. They cannot warm the beer. Word moved through the Krumholtz tent faster than any translator plate. It did not move as invasion. Nobody said invasion. What moved through that hall, table by table, in the flat, unimpressed tone that Bavarians reserve for genuine emergencies, was this. They cut Sepp's cooling. A brewer at table 9 stood up. Then his whole table stood up. Then the table behind them, who did not yet know why, but who assumed there was a reason. Sepp climbed onto a bench in the middle of the hall. He did not shout. He had never needed to shout in that tent. Listen to me, he said. Whatever is happening out there is happening to everybody. I do not know what they want. I know what they have done. They broke 4 glasses, they ruined Jorg's ox, and they have shut off my cellar. So we are going to be very calm and very organized. And we are going to be extremely unpleasant. 6,000 people made a noise that carried out onto the meadow and made 2 Draveth troopers turn around. What followed over the next hour was not a battle. It was worse than a battle. It was a festival deciding, collectively and without any meetings, that it was not going to be interrupted. At the Ferris wheel, the Draveth cut the power. 40 gondolas stopped in place, 70 feet up, full of tourists. The Concordat expected screaming. What they got was 40 gondolas of people leaning out to get a better look at the ships, and one Australian gentleman on the top car who began charging the gondola below him for the view. At the ox pit, Jorg and his crew took the bent spit off its mounts, dropped it across the lane, and turned it into the least sophisticated roadblock in military history. It worked because it was an 11-foot iron bar and it was extremely hot. At the old variety stage, a showman in a red coat was halfway through his act when 2 troopers walked in. He did not stop. He simply pointed at them and worked them into the routine. The audience laughed. The troopers, who had translator plates, and therefore understood every word, stood there being publicly described as poorly dressed, and stood in the doorway for 11 minutes, because the Concordat had no protocol for being roasted. At the giant slide, 3 troopers attempted to climb the moving belt that carries riders to the top. All 3 arrived back at the bottom, twice. And at the game's lane, Ottmar Zwick sat above his wooden disc with his microphone and watched 2 Draveth soldiers walk across it. The disc was 30 feet of polished hardwood, waxed daily, and the Draveth wore magnetic boot plates designed for the steel decking of a warship. On wax, the plates did nothing at all. They were 7 feet tall, top-heavy, and carrying 40 pounds of armor above the waist. Ottmar looked at them for a moment. Then he leaned into the microphone. "Gentlemen," he said, "please sit down." He pushed the lever. Meanwhile, under the Krumholtz tent, Marcus Hale had a problem and a discovery, and he could not decide which one frightened him more. "Sepp, Hansi, come here." He had a line tester clamped to a copper pipe, and the needle on it was swinging in a slow, steady rhythm. "That field they turned on," Marcus said, "it is not magic. It is sound, very low sound, way below what you can hear, but it is pressure and it moves through anything solid. I have got it in your gas lines. I have got it in the cellar walls." He looked up. "And I have got it in the frame of this tent." Sepp went cold. "Say that part again?" "Your tent is not canvas, Sepp. It is a steel skeleton with canvas on it, 1,100 tons of it. And a steel frame is a tuning fork." Marcus pointed at the tester. "They are shaking your building slowly. If they push that field up to full power, I do not know what your main beam does, and I do not want to find out with 6,000 people underneath it." Hansi Gruber said, very quietly. "Then we clear the tent." "To where?" Sepp said. "Every tent on this field has the same frame." Annalise came down the stairs with beer on her sleeves and a look on her face. "Sepp, they have started building something at the statue." They went up. At the western end of the grounds, at the foot of the stone terrace, where the bronze woman stood with her lion, the Draveth had opened the belly of their largest craft. Something was coming out of it on 4 hydraulic legs. It was the size of a house. It had a segmented ring at its top that turned slowly, and every time it turned, every hair on every arm in that field stood up. "That is the anchor," Marcus said. "That is the thing making the noise. Everything else is just repeating it." Ottmar Zwick arrived at Sepp's shoulder at that moment, wheezing slightly, having walked the length of the grounds. He looked at the machine on the terrace for a long moment. "How heavy?" he asked. "Very," said Marcus. "Good," said Ottmar. "Heavy things have a problem. Heavy things are only stable while nothing turns them." He tapped the ground with his stick. "That machine is standing on 4 legs on soft grass on a slope. And they parked it above a crowd of 100,000 people who have been drinking water all day, because Sepp's staff will not serve a man who cannot stand up straight." Sepp said, "Ottmar, talk sense." "I am talking perfect sense." The old man turned to face them. "You cannot shoot that machine, so do not take its footing away, blind the ones guarding it. And then hit it with the only thing on this field that 6,000 people can do together, at the same time, on the same note, without a single rehearsal." There was a pause. Conrad Fisher, who had come out to see what everyone was looking at, straightened up very slowly. "Marcus," he said, You said it is sound. Yes. Then answer me one question. The old conductor's voice had gone quite strange. If I put 6,000 voices and 11 brass instruments on one sustained tone against that, what happens? Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. Physically. If you hit the right frequency and you hold it long enough, and if you can get it close enough to the source, he said slowly, you would not cancel it, you would double it. You would push that emitter past what it was built to carry. How close is close enough? Under the ring, directly under it. Conrad looked up at the terrace, at the machine, at the bronze woman standing behind it with her hand raised. Then somebody, he said, is going to have to stand under it and hold something very heavy very still for a very long time. At the far end of the lane, the segmented ring stopped turning. And then it began to turn the other way. It started with the horses. Rudy Steinbach brought the 6-horse team down the main lane at a walk, which is not a dramatic speed, and that was exactly the point. Draft horses do not charge, they lean. 6 of them in harness, with a loaded brewery wagon behind them, is roughly the same problem as a slow-moving building. The Dravith line across the lane did what any professional line does. It ordered the obstacle to stop. The horses had never taken an order from anything in their lives except Rudy, and Rudy was busy. The line broke. 2 troopers went over the wagon. One went under it, which he survived, and about which he later declined to speak. Behind the wagon came the pretzel bakery. There is a bakery on the grounds that produces pretzels the size of steering wheels, and it stores flour in 50-pound sacks, and flour in the air is a fine white powder that goes into every vent. Joint and lens that a suit of armor has. 22 bakers and their families came up that lane throwing sacks like they were putting out a fire, and within 90 seconds the entire Dravith forward position was a cloud. Inside the cloud, 7-foot soldiers with single wide lenses were suddenly 7-foot soldiers who could not see anything at all. That, said Sepp Baumgartner, watching from the tent doorway, is the best money I ever spent on that man's rent. At the game's lane, Ottmar Zwick was running the busiest shift of his career. Dravith troopers, blinded and disoriented, fell back into the arena because the arena had wide doors and the crowd had helpfully left them open. They arrived on 30 feet of waxed hardwood. Ottmar let 11 of them get on before he touched the lever. Ladies and gentlemen, he said into the microphone in the voice of a man who has waited 41 seasons for exactly this, please welcome our guests. The disc began to turn. Armor does not help. Weight does not help. Height actively hurts. The first trooper came off at 8 seconds and hit the padded ring hard enough to bounce. The second took his own squad leader out on the way. By 20 seconds it was not a fight. It was a laundry machine, and 300 people were hanging over the rail counting out loud. Ottmar leaned into the microphone. Everything that stands up, he announced, falls down. Under the Krumholtz tent, it was going considerably worse. Marcus Hale and Hansi Gruber were in the cellar with the pressure lines, because Marcus had one idea, and it depended on the one thing he actually understood. The anchor's 4 legs were mounted on hydraulic couplings. Hydraulic fluid has a working temperature. Below that temperature, it stops flowing and starts behaving like cold honey, and a leg that cannot adjust cannot compensate for a machine that is being shaken. And under that tent, there were 42 carbon dioxide cylinders, a glycol chiller, and 300 meters of copper line. If I dump the whole gas bank through the cold side, Marcus said, dragging a manifold across the floor, I get maybe 90 seconds of extremely cold gas out of one nozzle. That is it. One shot. I have to be at the leg. Then we get you to the leg, said Hansi. They were connecting the last coupling when the field went to 2/3 power. The whole cellar moved, not shook. Moved the way a boat moves. A pressure line that Hansi's brother-in-law had installed with the wrong gasket blew off its collar at 1,100 pounds and whipped across the corridor. And Hansi Gruber went down hard and did not get up. Hansi, Marcus got to him. There was blood at the hairline and his arm was wrong at the elbow and he was conscious, which Marcus decided to be extremely grateful for. Marta, Marcus shouted up the stairs. Medic, get the medic. Marta Lindner came down those stairs in 9 seconds flat with her bag already open. She had spent every season of her adult life at the aid post on those grounds, and she had seen crush injuries and burns, and one memorable incident involving a Ferris wheel and a wedding party. And she did not waste a single motion. Broken, 2 places, do not move him. Hansi grabbed Marcus's collar with his good hand. The gas, he said. Take the gas, Hansi. 3 fingers of foam, Hansi said, and not a millimeter more, go. Upstairs, the tent was failing, the steel frame was singing. Anyone who has stood next to a large bell after it has been struck knows the sound. And now 1,100 tons of it was doing that above 6,000 people. Dust came down off the crossbeams in straight gray lines. A lighting rig sheared loose over aisle 6, and analyst Reiter shoulder checked, 2 students out from under it half a second before it landed. Sepp Baumgartner stood in the middle of his grandfather's tent and understood with total clarity that he had about 4 minutes. He could not empty the hall. 6,000 people cannot clear a building in 4 minutes, and the lanes outside were full of 100,000 more. Conrad Fischer came down off his gallery with his stick in his hand, and his left palm cut open from where a falling bracket had caught him. Sepp, I know. Marcus needs to be at that machine, and I need every voice on this field on one note. And neither of those things happen unless somebody holds the horn steady underneath the ring. Conrad's voice was flat. It is a bass horn, 31 pounds. It has to be aimed at the emitter at arm's length, held absolutely still for as long as it takes. In that field, Sepp said. With the ground moving. Yes, nobody can do that. Annalise Reiter came out of aisle 6 with dust in her hair, a full stein still in her left hand, and not one drop of it spilled. Conrad, she said, which horn? On the flagship, Peldranic's readout had stopped making sense, and Overseer Vor Kalish had stopped asking him to explain it. Full power, Vor Kalish said. Overseer, at full power, the structures on that field will not hold. There are civilians inside them. That is not doctrine. That is a massacre. The index reads 106, Vor Kalish said. 106 dropped objects in 6 million. We have been on this world for 1 hour, and this population has not blinked. He turned. Full power. Break them. The segmented ring above the meadow began to turn faster than it had all day, and out on that field 100,000 people felt the ground go out from under the world. And on the wooden gallery of the Krumholtz tent, an old man with a bleeding hand raised a carved stick over 11 brass players and held it there. Conrad Fischer did not start with the toast song. He started with one note, a single sustained tone from 11 brass instruments, low and flat and enormous, and it rolled out of the Krumholtz tent and across the meadow like weather. 6,000 people inside that hall had heard that band every 20 minutes for 2 weeks. They did not need to be told. They stood up in a building that was shaking itself apart, and they raised their glasses, and they came in underneath it. The tent next door heard it through the wall and joined in. Then the tent after that. Then the ox pit, and the games lane, and 40 stalled gondolas 70 feet up on a dead Ferris wheel, and the roadblocks and the aid post. And 100,000 people packed into the lanes with nowhere to go and nothing to do, but the one thing everybody there already knew how to do together. It was not singing exactly, it was closer to a single organ note produced by a city. Overseer, Peldranic was on his feet. Overseer, we have a counter signal. From what? From them. From the population. Overseer, they are matching the carrier frequency. His hands were moving over the panel. They are not resisting the field, they are feeding it. Amplitude is climbing. The emitter is taking every bit of it back. And under the segmented ring, on the terrace at the foot of the bronze statue, Annalise Reiter raised 31 pounds of brass to arm's length and locked her elbow. The ground here was worse than anywhere. This close to the source, the dissonance was not a tilt. It was a hand shoving at her ribs from 4 directions at once. Her boots slid on wet grass. The bell of the horn had to stay inside a circle roughly the size of a dinner plate, aimed up at the ring, and it had to stay there. She had spent 19 seasons carrying 70 pounds of glass through a moving crowd without looking down. She was, quite possibly, the most qualified person on the planet. Hold it, Conrad's voice came through the handset at her belt. Hold it, Annalise, she held it. 20 feet away, Marcus Hale was crawling under the machine with a manifold on his back and a nozzle in his fist, through grass, under 4 hydraulic legs the width of oak trees. In a field of sound that was trying to turn his stomach inside out. He got to the rear left coupling. He wedged the nozzle into the joint. He put both hands on the valve. 90 seconds, he said to nobody. Come on. He opened it all the way. 42 cylinders of carbon dioxide went through a glycol-chilled copper line, and out of one nozzle in a white roaring jet directly into a hydraulic coupling. And the temperature at that joint dropped through the floor. The leg locked. A machine standing on 4 legs on soft ground, being shaken by a resonance it was generating and could no longer control, with one leg that could no longer adjust. Developed a problem it had never been designed to survive. It began to lean. "Analyst, it is moving," Marcus shouted. "Conrad, it is moving. Hold the note, hold the note." Conrad Fisher, 70 years old, standing on a wooden gallery in a building that was screaming, held his stick up and would not let it fall. The tone climbed. The segmented ring turned and shuddered and turned, and the sound it was making went up and up into a register that nothing that size should ever reach. And Annalise Reiter stood underneath it with her arm out straight and her jaw set and a full stein in her other hand. And then the anchor blew. The emitter ring came apart at 4 points, and the field went out like a light being switched off, and every single person on that meadow felt the ground come back. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then 100,000 people made a noise that was recorded by 3 seismic stations. The machine came down on its side on the terrace grass. Marcus Hale got out from under it with roughly 6 feet to spare and lay on his back, and started laughing in a way that Marta Lindner later described as medically interesting. Annalise lowered the horn. Her arm shook so hard she could not open her hand for a full minute. She had not spilled the stein. 60 miles west, at Ramstein Air Base, Colonel Ray Sutton had been watching a wall of dead readouts for the better part of an hour. Every guided system in southern Germany had been blind since the Draveth arrived, because the dissonance had been sitting on the entire electromagnetic spectrum like a boot. Every board in that room came alive at once. "Sir, interference is gone. It is just gone." Colonel Sutton did not waste time asking why. "Launch everything." What arrived over Munich in the following 11 minutes was a combined response of German, American, and Allied aircraft that had been circling outside the exclusion zone with nothing to do, and a great deal of frustration about it. The Draveth landing craft went first. The support ships turned for orbit and did not make it. The flagship tried to withdraw with 3 engines out and a hull full of alarms. "Overseer," said Peldranik, very quietly, "final index reading." Vorkalish looked at him. 411, Peldranik said. 411 dropped objects. In 6 million people, under a full power field. For 71 minutes. The overseer of the Draveth Concordat, whose people had unmade 42 worlds without firing a shot, stood on a burning command deck above a field in Bavaria and understood, finally and completely, that he had brought a machine that measures fear to the one place on the planet where nobody was going to let go of anything. The flagship came down at the eastern edge of the grounds, in the parking area, on 11 cars and a portable toilet block. And out of the wreckage, coughing, unarmed, with his translator plate cracked down the middle, climbed Overseer Vorkalish. He looked up. Sepp Baumgartner was standing in front of him with 200 bakers, waiters, brewers, horse drivers, and one very small old man with a stick. "You," said Sepp, "are paying for the glasses. The tally took 9 days. That is not a joke about paperwork. That is the actual number of days it took the tent associations, the city, and about 400 volunteers to work out what had been broken on that meadow. And the strangest part of the entire event is that the number everyone kept coming back to was not the ships or the craters or the collapsed pavilion. It was the glasses. 9,406 one-liter steins were destroyed on the grounds that day, out of roughly 200,000 in circulation. Every one of them was counted. Sepp Baumgartner personally signed the Krumholtz figure, and then wrote at the bottom of the page in pen, "Not our fault," and underlined it twice. Hansi Gruber came out of surgery with 11 pins in his arm and immediately began complaining about the hospital's foam. Conrad Fischer's hand needed 9 stitches. He conducted the reopening with it wrapped, which he claimed improved his grip. Annalise Reiter could not lift her right arm above her shoulder for 3 weeks. When she could, the first thing she did was pick up 12 steins and walk them down aisle 4, because she said if she waited any longer she would start thinking about it. Marcus Hale did not go home to Milwaukee. He was offered a permanent contract on the grounds roughly 40 minutes after the anchor fell, by 4 different tent owners. In a bidding process he described as the most flattering experience of his life. He took Sepp's offer. He said the seller had the best gaskets now, on account of him having replaced all of them personally out of spite. Ottmar Zwick refused every interview request he received. He gave exactly one statement from his seat above the wooden disc to a local paper. "They were very tall," he said. "Tall is not an advantage. Ask anybody who has ever been on my ride." Rudy Steinbach's lead horse, a gray mare, became the most photographed animal in Europe and remained entirely uninterested in this. And on the 11th day, in a repaired corner of the Krumholtz tent, with soldiers at the doors and a stenographer at the end of the bench, Overseer Vorkalish sat down across a wooden table from Sepp Baumgartner. Sepp put a full stein down in front of him. "You cannot drink it," Sepp said. "Your people cannot process it, I checked. It is there because in this tent, when a man sits at my table, something goes in front of him. That is how it works." Vorkalish looked at the glass for a long moment. "I have a question," he said. "I assumed my people have ended 42 civilizations." The translator plate was new, and it made his voice sound almost gentle. "We do not kill them. We simply demonstrate that the ground is not reliable. Every population we have measured has the same reaction. They let go of what they are holding, and then they let go of each other, and then it is finished. It takes an average of 6 hours." He looked up. "You were under a full field for 71 minutes. You had a building failing above 6,000 people. And your population's total loss of composure by every instrument we have was 411 dropped objects." He paused. "Why did you not break?" Sepp Baumgartner thought about it for a while. He was not a fast man, and he did not pretend to be. "You want the honest answer," he said. "Or the one that sounds good. The honest one. The honest one is that most of those people had no idea what was happening." Sepp turned the stein a quarter turn on the wood. "They were not being brave. They did not have the information to be brave. They just knew the glass in their hand was not theirs, and that somebody counts it, and that if you drop it, you have to go tell a person at a desk why." He leaned back. "You want to know what your machine was measuring? It was measuring whether we care about small things. That was your test. And this is the wrong field for that test, because on this field everything is a small thing. The foam is 3 fingers. The ox turns for 11 hours. The song plays every 20 minutes and everybody stands up, whether they feel like it or not, because that is when it plays." He tapped the table once. "You landed in a place where 6 million strangers had already agreed to do the same thing at the same time, on purpose, for no reason all day. And then you turned on a weapon that only works on people who have not agreed on anything." Vorkalish sat very still. "We did not understand the significance," he said. "No," said Sepp. "You really did not." Conrad Fischer, sitting 2 seats down with his bandaged hand around a glass of water, added the last word. "We did not hold the line," he said. "We held the glass. The line came with it. That line went around the world in about 4 hours, which is roughly 140 times faster than the Dravith Concordat had ever moved anything. If you made it this far, drop a comment and tell me which moment was your favorite. Was it Ottmar and the wooden disc? Was it Conrad refusing to stop the song? Or was it Annalise standing under that machine with her arm out and a full glass in the other hand? And share this one with the person you would want beside you in that tent, because that is genuinely the highest compliment this story can give you." The Concordat's surviving vessels reached their own space eventually. The report that came out of that engagement was reviewed at the highest level, and it changed Dravith doctrine permanently. The Composure Index was retired. It had held for 42 worlds, and it had failed once, and the review board decided that once was enough. The updated survey entry for the 3rd planet of that system was short. Item 1. This species does not measure stability the way we do. Do not assume that a population holding a fragile object is vulnerable. On this world, a population holding a fragile object is at its most stable. Item 2. Do not attempt psychological operations against gatherings that are already voluntary. A crowd that chose to be a crowd cannot be turned into a mob. There is nothing left to break. Item 3. The southern province designated Bavaria is classified as a total operational exclusion. Do not land there. Do not survey it. Do not attempt contact during the autumn assembly under any circumstances. Item 4, and this was added by Pel Dranic personally, and remains in the record. Under no conditions interfere with the temperature of their beer. Back on the meadow, the grounds reopened on a cold, bright morning to the largest crowd anyone had ever recorded there. The bronze woman stood on her terrace with her lion, looking down at the tents going back up, exactly as she had looked down at everything else. Inside the Krumholtz tent at 11:04, Conrad Fischer lifted his stick. The band started the toast song, and 6,000 people stood up. Thanks for watching.